Yo, what's going on, everybody? It's You May Be Seated here, bringing you the long-awaited open class tuning guide. In this video, we're going to start with basic build information and what to look for in your build. And then we're going to discuss the hot topic of meta tuning in this game. There are certain settings in a tune that are extremely impactful, but they come with negative consequences. There are ways you can build and tune your car to mitigate these negative consequences, but no matter what, if you go to the extremes, there will be negative consequences. After we discuss the build and tuning information, I'm going to try to answer some of the most common questions, like does this also work in rear-wheel drive? Does it only work in road cars? And does it only work in lower classes? If there's any other questions that you have, feel free to leave a comment and I'll try to give an in-depth answer. We're going to start things off in this video with the build guide. In open class lobbies, racing tires are the meta because the PI system scores based off of mediums and you don't need to pit in the race, so having soft tires is just free grip. Now rear tires are going to be your stability and front tires are going to be your rotation. You don't want to just slam the max rotation in lower classes because the PI cost is so much that the cars will be extremely slow when they accelerate or top end. I'm sure most of you know this already, but the sport brakes usually make your PI go down but still give you braking comparable to the race brakes. Obviously the weight's going to vary per car, but it's also going to vary in how they respond to these type of setups I'm going to show you in a minute. Some handle these setups better being lighter and some are fine with being heavier. The lighter the car, the further towards the front I typically go with the weight distribution, but don't be afraid to experiment because there's no one size fits all for this tuning method. I can't emphasize enough the impact that rims can have. Like, I know that's shocking, but they can make or break a build sometimes. I always come to this section of rims because right here you have the heaviest, right here you have the lightest, these are also the lightest, right here you have a middleweight rim that's closer to the light, and then right here you have middleweight rim closer to the heavy. I usually start with the heaviest because you get the most bang for your buck in the PI system with heavy rims, but more often than not the cars handle better with the light rims. And like I said, the rims can make or break a build, so if your car's not handling right, try switching them and it might change everything. One thing I haven't done too much testing on is changing the size of front versus back or just overall. I almost always just make them the max size and just go with it. For the aerodynamics, there's not too much to say. You can kind of do what you want with it. The only thing I will say is with the front race bumper, sometimes these setups handle it better if you take the front race bumper off and just run stock bumper or one of the street bumpers. Unless your car is just going to be way too heavy or you have to give up too much tire grip to take a supercharger, you want to take the CF supercharger whenever you see it available. As an example, if we tried to take this into C-Class with the supercharger and the better engine, it would put us over the limit. So we would need to go back to the stock engine with the supercharger and upgrade that with parts. If we were to try to take this into B, you can see it can't fit the supercharger. This is one of the engines that I think it is okay and better than dropping back down an engine. If you can fit the V6, it's typically stronger. There are exceptions to this. If the car's too heavy in B class, then maybe it will be more advantageous to drop back down an engine. For those who don't know, if you put on a racing transmission, you can put on manual with clutch, and you don't even need to use the clutch. You can just shift normally, and it's faster than it would be if you were just using manual. After you've done all the important stuff, you can come back with the remaining PI and decide if you want to make it lighter, have wider tires, or add power. Personally, I just like the way the sport and race exhaust sound, so I always try to grab one of those. And if you hit your PI limit or are like one off, I always come to the drive line and check and see if I can fit one little one in if I'm already at the PEI limit, or if I can fit more in if I'm under. And that's going to wrap things up for the build portion of the video. Now we're going to move on to the part that most of you are looking forward to, and that is the tuning. I do think these bump setups I'm about to show you function better with higher tire pressures than like the normal. I see most downloaded tunes are in like the mid to high 20s, and it seems these bump setups, no matter what weight the car is, tend to function better with higher pressure than that. For the alignment, I used to run -0.8 and -0.9 on everything. Sometimes I would do -1.1, and on rare occasion, I would raise the rear as high as like -2.2 if the back end of the car was kicking out or sliding mid-corner. However, recently one of my teammates showed me that even lower cambers than what I used to run are better for these bump setups. As long as you're under -1, you should be okay. The only time I would go above -1 is on a rear wheel drive car for the front camber, maybe like 1.1 or 1.3. For the toe angle, I used to run -0.2 and -0.3 on my front wheel drives and 0.0 on rear wheel drive, but my teammate showed me recently that 0.0 is just better on both. Occasionally I'll deviate from that a little bit. If you go in the negatives with the rear toe, it can help stabilize the car, and one or two clicks in the front can help turn in. Caster is always 7. For the most part, your roll bars are going to stay 40-40 in all these setups. You can kind of treat them the way you're supposed to treat roll bars. You lower the front if you want oversteer, or lower the rear if you want understeer or stability. But sometimes changing these affects the way the car handles the bump setup, so you have to just put it back to 40-40 regardless. Tuning the springs is not critical to the setup, so you can kind of play with those and get the car to feel how you want it to feel. In general, raising the rear higher than the front will promote oversteer and vice versa understeer. For the ride height in these bump setups, you typically just want to slam both of them. It'll just make the car more consistent with these bump tunes. It is okay to raise the rear if your car can handle it, but it really comes down to how high you go with your dampening and your anti-dive, and I'll get to that in a second. The dampening and the suspension geometry are the two most impactful pieces of the tune. We're going to put them up a little bit, and then I'm going to come back and talk more about it. For the suspension geometry, you want to put your roll centers at 9898, and then your anti-dive I'll talk more about in a second. For anti-squat, for front wheel drive, you want to do 150 always. And then for rear wheel drive, you want to start at -50. But if you're in a car that feels pretty planted and you feel like you could use a little more rotation, you can go to like -25 or maybe even 0. But it's pretty rare that you'll be able to go any higher than that without the car feeling like it's going to slide. But we are in a front wheel drive currently, so we are going to put it back to 150 and then finish the rest of the tune and come back to anti-dive and the dampening. For downforce, you typically want to run the max front and the minimum rear. I'm not running a race bumper in this, so there is no max front. The only time you would want to raise the rear is perhaps in a rear wheel drive car that's sliding too much and you just want to stabilize the car. Now the brakes are something that make front wheel drive a little better in these setups, but we're going to finish the rest of the tune real quick and then come back to the brakes. I run 100 decel in front wheel drive, but I run 0 decel in rear wheel drive. The only time I would raise the decel in rear wheel drive is for braking stability. Now pay attention to the brake distance from 100 to 0. We're at 266 baseline. We're going to move this to the rear, and you can see it goes up to 294. That's a really bad brake distance. Now we're going to put this back towards the center and raise the pressure. So with high pressure back in the center, it stays about the same, 266 to 268, not much different. But if you raise both, the brake balance towards the rear, and the pressure, it's dropped all the way below 200 feet. Some cars actually go as low as like 160 feet. And because the brake pressure is so high, many people find that using ABS with these setups is easier. It's not required by any means, but it can help. Alright, we're going to talk about bump stiffness and anti-dive. The higher you go with bump stiffness and the higher you go with anti-dive, the more grip your car will have in corners. At the bare minimum, you should be running 7.7 bump and around 25 to 50 anti-dive. I wouldn't go lower than that on either of those, or you're just making your car slower for no reason. You're probably thinking maybe I should just slam them to 13.13 and 150, but remember, there's negative consequences the higher you go, and you might really dislike the way the car drives. I personally think the anti-dive is more important. So if you're going to start with like lower bump, maybe like 7.5, I would run anywhere from like 75 to 150 anti-dive with that and just see how it feels. If the car is a little too volatile for you at that point, maybe lower the anti-dive and raise the bump just a little bit. But you can experiment with what's best for your comfort levels. If you've tried any of my setups, pretty much all of them on the leaderboards are 11.10 bump with 150 anti-dive. I have some Mini Coopers and MK2s that are max 13.13 with 150, but for the most part it's 11 bump. Once you've played around with the bump and the geometry and got it where you wanted, make sure you go back to the brakes and fine-tune the brakes for the best brake distance. Remember, this brake distance trick only works with front wheel drive for the most part because it has to do with the anti-squat and bump paired together. So because rear wheel drives can't run max squat, or at least not many of them can run max squat, they don't get to benefit from this brake distance in the same way that front wheel drives do. And now we're going to answer some of the more common questions I get. I'm going to show examples of hot laps and the tunes that I ran. And I'm going to talk about the performance and punishment differences of front wheel drive and rear wheel drive with these setups. Here you can see that rear wheel drives are capable of dropping these insane times as well. The main difference between front wheel drive and rear wheel drive, besides the brakes, is just the consistency of the car with these setups. The punishment is much greater in a rear wheel drive. But here's an example lap and tune with a rear wheel drive car. The acceleration of the Mini Cooper here is just too strong, so obviously it's not going to beat that. But if my Mini Cooper wasn't there, it's still capable of dropping world record times. But I'm going to show you guys the exact tuning numbers that I used. I'm running 11 bump in this. My Mini is 13, so maybe if I raised this to 13, it would compete a little better with the Mini Cooper. But I'm not the biggest fan of how rear wheel drives function with these setups. And with that, we're going to talk about the punishment differences of rear wheel drive and front wheel drives and show examples of each. The punishment in front wheel drive is typically just really hard understeer. So right here I touch the grass, or if you touch a curb it will react the same way. If you're on throttle when you touch it, your car will just understeer really hard and there's like no way to snap out of it. Here's another example. On corner entry, the car is washed out because of this setup, and it just understeers to where you can't do anything and you're off track. As bad as that seems, the rear wheel drive examples here are way worse in my opinion. Instead of just understeering, They just lose all traction and just slide on ice. It is awful. Now these examples are with 13 bump and 150 anti-dive, so it's not quite as bad if you go lower, but I just wanted to show the most egregious examples and show why you may not want to max out your tune. Now for the other two questions, does it only work in road cars and does it only work in lower classes? I don't want this video to be any longer than it already is, so we'll just answer these. It works in everything, but it's less advantageous the higher class you get. There's multiple reasons for this, but the biggest reason would be that these setups allow you to carry slightly more momentum, and that momentum is more valuable in slower cars that take longer to accelerate. But the punishment is also greater in lower classes, especially E-class. If your car starts sliding or if you understeer really hard, you lose a lot of time because it takes the car so much longer to get going again. One other question I get is how big of an advantage are these setups over like mid to low bump setups? And to answer that, I have a 6 bump setup here with 90 anti-dive, and you see a leaderboard comparison and how the car drives. I ran the FTO because the guy in 11th was talking trash to me, even though he was running 10.5 bump in his setup. With equal bump setups, the FTO is about half a second slower on this track than the Celica and Integra. So the difference between like 6 or 7 bump and 11 to 13 bump is about 1 second per minute. Now I'll show you guys the tune and I'll talk about some things you could do with a setup like this to make it a little bit faster while still using setups that aren't running too high of bump or too high of anti-dive. You could potentially adjust the roll bars, but the ride height would be one to start with. Raising the rear would give you more rotation without the punishment that comes with running high bump. But as you can see, you can still drop top 10 times while running mid bump. I do recommend that you don't lower the anti-dive unless you have to. I would start with 6 or 7 bump and keep your anti-dive at 150 and then work your bump up until you find a level that you're comfortable with. There is no RNG to these setups, but there is an extreme learning curve, and a lot of people get very frustrated with driving them and just give up. But that's going to wrap things up for this video. If you feel I left anything out, feel free to leave a comment. I'll try to answer any and all questions that I get, and I'll catch you guys in my next video.